down and you open the paper, or you pull up your iPhone app or iPad app, or for me, you open your computer, and you're looking at the news headlines. What are some of the first things you might see? Think about that. Yeah, someone said North Korea, exactly. The leader of North Korea is going to bomb some other country. Or there's someone like this morning, John Kerry is in North Korea, talking and responding. Or maybe it's the budget crisis and President Obama is responding. Or Paul Ryan is responding, or any other politician. Or maybe it's a week back and I saw a headline about the leader of Guatemala was on trial for genocide. But either way, there's a common theme in these stories. There's a need or a fascination maybe with leadership. There's even this story when we go broader in books such as Lord of the Flies, where this metaphor of anarchy is played out, and the author seems to comment that human nature needs a leader. There is an investment in leadership, a need for leadership, we might even say, because we can't get along without it, right? And our story, when we look at our story, seems to even comment on this as well. Some of these details that we look at indicate that. So, the miracle story. The disciples don't catch anything until Jesus shows up, right? So, the disciples have been fishing all night, and nothing happens. And Jesus shows up, which they don't know it's Jesus, but Jesus shows up and says, try the other side. And all of a sudden, they can't even pull in the catch. It's so big. But then the story progresses, and this miracle all of a sudden causes the beloved disciple to realize, wait a second, that's the Lord. And so John, the author of John, has this theme of miracles leading to faith, as the steward points out. And we see it again in this story. Jesus' miracle causes the disciples to go and have faith that it is, in fact, the Lord, and not just some stranger. And then as we get to the end of the story, the disciples don't even feed themselves. The disciples, it seems, can't feed themselves. Jesus has a fire going and gives them bread and fish, and that's that. In fact, some commentators of this story, such as Matthew Henry, say that this story is the last step before the disciples can even do their own work. This miracle had to happen in this story before the disciples to even do anything. Or even further, the miracle was emphasized through the threefold repetition of the signs of it, as Gail Day points out. Jesus, the leader, is the one that is able to cause all of the happenings and all the doings of the disciples. This story seems to say that, again, we can't do anything unless we have a leader. But as we good, faithful Christians, we might question this concept, right? We might question, is it really the case that we have to have a leader? Do we as Christians need someone telling us what to do? Questions such as, do we so favor certain skills or certain people with talents that we're willing to turn others away from leadership? What about the people who can't get the education needed? What about those who can't? Do we turn them away too? Or even beyond the people who we might be turning away, what about us? What about our responsibility? Do we discount or put aside our responsibility because we don't have a leader? Because someone isn't telling us what to do? But what about this mentality of, I'm waiting on Jesus? Jesus hasn't told me what to do yet, right? So we can't do anything. Or what if we never hear Jesus? What if we never hear that still small voice? Can we then justify our complacency because we don't see Jesus? What do we as Christians do then? Can we do anything? that is so prevalent is no longer adequate. And we come back to this story, which I would encourage you to do, looking at new details, or maybe noticing different ones. Details such as how Jesus performs the miracle. Jesus isn't creating something out of nothing. Jesus is using the professions of the disciples already there. Jesus uses the skills and talents of these fisher people to do the miracle. And beyond that, when Jesus performs the miracle, the nets that the disciples have are able to contain it. In other stories, the nets start to break, but here, in John's telling, the nets are enough. What the people have, what the disciples have, is enough. And even the reactions of the disciples to the miracle. Each disciple reacts differently. The beloved disciple whispers to Peter. Peter jumps out of the boat, and the other disciples simply pull the boat in. When these details are taken, leadership maybe takes a different focus. Jesus isn't the only one leading here. The beloved disciple is leading. Peter is leading. The other disciples are leading. Leadership in this new light is more organic. It's more us instead of you. And even in the end, Jesus doesn't just feed the disciples. Jesus asks them to bring their own fish. And this is really interesting because the story before it tells us there's already fish on the fire. Jesus is already having the food ready. But somehow, for some reason, Jesus asks the disciples to bring their own fish. Maybe even saying, "Come, be a leader with me." Jesus is not the only leader in this story. In fact, if we take it seriously, maybe God is even saying that we, normal, everyday fisher people, or teachers, or chaplains, or retirees, or parents, we are called to be leaders. God is calling us to be those leaders like Peter, like the beloved disciple, like even Jesus. These fishermen, while they are still fishing, are called. We as people, while we're doing our normal, boring, everyday jobs, are called to use those skills to be the leaders. We might say God is saying, get on with your boring stuff. Because, indeed, in this story, that is where the miracles happen. In those boring, everyday moments of life. We introverts are welcome. The beloved disciple maybe was that introvert. We extroverts are welcome. Maybe that's Peter. All of us are welcome to be those leaders. As our tradition proclaims, or as a Christian tradition proclaims, while we are, or we were yet sinners, Jesus is using, or has used, or is still using us. As we at Peace proclaim, the Spirit is rising in our midst, indeed in one another. The Spirit is calling us to be those leaders. It's not just one person. And so imagine with me what this leadership might look like. Maybe this leadership, having just come out of Lent, involves some spiritual journey. Maybe it involves going to other religious places of worship and seeing if these resonate with us. Maybe it's simply praying more regularly. Maybe it's simply going for a walk or a run every morning. Maybe it's meditating more regularly. Maybe it's turning on music each morning as we get ready, as we read that paper, as we get that cup of coffee. But maybe that leadership is among the church as well. Maybe it's among on peace. Maybe it's getting plugged into a leadership or a ministry circle that we've always thought about joining. Maybe it's starting a small group of people from the church to worship or just talk about our lives each week, each month. Or maybe it's something beyond our spiritual lives. Maybe it's something like getting involved in the community. Maybe it's helping with Webster Groves Ministries. Maybe it's sponsoring a child through one of the many organizations. Maybe it's serving at the bridge. So no matter what you imagine or what you think God might be calling you to, hear that God is calling you. That each week we radically proclaim that the Spirit is rising in our midst. And here today that this story attests to that. That indeed the Spirit is rising and has risen. That we as people, as Christians, as followers of Jesus, as whatever you identify with, we are the Spirit. The Spirit has risen and is rising. May we today remember to